Picture this, it's 1962. The United States government is sitting in a smoke-filled room, staring at a map of Cuba, and someone, probably after their third cup of military-grade coffee, says, "What if, hear me out, we invade ourselves?" Now, if you're lying in bed right now thinking, that can't be real, well, congratulations. You've just had the same reaction as President John F. Kennedy did. Welcome to Sleepy Dreamer in America, where we explore the strangest corners of U.S. history, slowly, soothingly, and with just enough absurdity to make you question every civics class you ever took. Tonight's story is one that sounds like a rejected Twilight Zone episode written by an over-caffeinated general. Operation Northwoods, the secret U.S. plan. To fake terrorist attacks on American soil, to justify a war against Cuba. So snuggle up, maybe dim the lights, and let's gently drift into one of the most bizarre military proposals in American history. A bedtime story from the Cold War, featuring paranoia, paperwork, and the persistent human ability to make terrible ideas sound official. Fektundir. It's 1961. The Cold War isn't just cold. It's frosty, icy, frozen solid like your grandma's freezer. The United States and the Soviet Union are in a silent staring contest, each with enough nuclear firepower to toast the entire planet like a marshmallow. President Kennedy has just taken office, inheriting a country that's both terrified of communism and somehow fascinated by it. You can't even order a Cuban sandwich without someone whispering, "Are you sure that's safe?" And just 90 miles off the coast of Florida sits Cuba, that rebellious island led by Fidel Castro, the bearded revolutionary who went from freedom fighter to enemy of democracy, faster than you can say, CIA disinformation. Now the US government had already tried something bold. You might have heard of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which, despite its adventurous name, involved surprisingly few pigs and an enormous amount of embarrassment. In April 1961, the CIA sent a group of Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. It didn't go great. Picture a beach, a bunch of poorly coordinated rebels, and Castro himself watching the whole thing unfold with what I can only imagine was a very smug cigar. The invasion failed spectacularly, and after that humiliation, the Pentagon wanted redemption. They wanted something big, bold, dramatic, and this time maybe less likely to be televised as a disaster. Enter the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military brass of the United States, are not exactly known for their sense of humor. These are men who measure time and missile ranges and think of the word plausible as an artistic challenge. So in early 1962, they start working on a plan, a proposal for something that would convince the American public that invading Cuba was not only justified, but downright necessary. And here's the twist. They decided the best way to do that was to make America itself look like the victim. That's right. They proposed faking terrorist attacks on US soil, hijackings, bombings, even staged funerals, and blaming it all on Cuba. I know what you're thinking. This sounds like a conspiracy theory from YouTube at 2 a.m. But no, this one actually happened. It's all written down, neatly typed, with bullet points and military letterheads. Because apparently when you're planning international deception, you still have to format it correctly. The plan was called Operation Northwoods, and its creators, the U.S. Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs themselves, the highest military officers in the land. Let's pause and let that marinate. The top brass of the U.S. military proposed attacking their own people, or at least pretending to, in order to start a war. Now, if you're feeling slightly more awake after hearing that, that's okay. Take a deep breath. This story will get stranger, but we'll walk through it slowly, because no one should sprint through madness. We stroll, softly. To understand why anyone thought this was reasonable, we need to peek inside the American mind of the early 60s. This was the golden age of paranoia. The Red Scare had left deep marks. Everyone thought spies were everywhere. In the government, in Hollywood, possibly even in your neighborhood barbershop. If your neighbor installed a new antenna, there was a solid chance someone called the FBI movies warned of communist infiltration. Children practiced nuclear drills in school, ducking under desks that would frankly do very little against a nuclear blast, but gave everyone something to do. And the military? They were convinced Cuba had become a Soviet beachhead, a tropical launch pad for missiles aimed straight at Miami. That fear created a strange environment, one where almost any idea, no matter how absurd, could be justified with the words national security. You could propose strapping dynamite to a goat and calling it psychological warfare, and someone in Washington would at least take notes. So when Operation Northwoods appeared, it wasn't an isolated burst of madness. It was the logical, if terrifying, extension of Cold War logic. In March 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff officially drafted the Operation Northwoods memo. It was addressed to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who was, in many ways, the middleman between the general's wild imaginations and the president's actual sanity. The memo was labeled Top Secret. Inside were detailed suggestions for creating a false pretext for war. Among the proposed options, and I use that word loosely because these are less options and more moral catastrophes, were things like faking hijackings of civilian airliners, staging bombings in American cities and blaming them on Cuban agents, sinking boats filled with supposed refugees, even mock funerals for victims, complete with fake lists of the dead, and all of this to convince the American public that Cuba was a menace that needed to be dealt with militarily. They even considered using actual planes and drones, decades before drones were mainstream, to simulate attacks. Imagine that, your government proposing deepfake warfare before computers were even cool. Every line of the memo reads like a fever dream, written by people who had access to far too much authority and far too little empathy. One proposal even suggested blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming it on Cuban sabotage. Sound familiar? That's right. They literally wrote, "Remember the Maine," a callback to 1898, the explosion that started the Spanish-American War. Because nothing says progress like recycling old propaganda techniques. Now, before we imagine these generals as cartoon villains twirling mustaches, it's important to remember they thought they were being patriotic. They genuinely believed that America's survival depended on aggressive action against Castro. The main architect of this masterpiece of bad ideas was General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Lemnitzer was a serious, by-the-book officer, the kind of man who ironed his coffee if he thought it would help discipline. He and his colleagues presented the Northwoods plan as just one proposal in a larger series called Operation Mongoose, a set of covert actions aimed at destabilizing Cuba. They weren't just thinking about war, they were thinking about plausible deniability, information warfare, and psychological manipulation. Which translated into human terms means, how can we lie convincingly enough to justify violence? When you read their language today, it's chillingly bureaucratic. There's no drama, no emotion, just careful phrasing like, we could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area. You know, casual stuff. Just your everyday suggestion to fake terrorism for democracy. It's almost poetic how calm it sounds, until you remember that these words were meant to be real operations, potentially killing real people. And yet somehow, the memo made it. All the way to McNamara's desk. John F. Kennedy, for all his flaws, had a firm limit on how many morally unhinged proposals he was willing to entertain before breakfast. When the Northwoods plan reached the White House, it was swiftly and silently rejected. Kennedy and McNamara both refused to authorize it. In private, Kennedy began losing trust in the Joint Chiefs, and particularly in Lemnitzer. Not long after, Lemnitzer was reassigned, promoted sideways, as bureaucrats like to say, to a NATO post in Europe, which is the political version of saying, you're too dangerous to have around here, but we don't want to make a scene. And just like that, Operation Northwoods vanished into the vault of classified history. Filed away, forgotten, until the 1990s. But that part of the story, how it was rediscovered, how it reshaped the world of conspiracy culture, and how it proves the line between democracy and madness can be very, very thin. Well, we'll drift there soon. For now, close your eyes for a second. Imagine the Pentagon at midnight in 1962. Fluorescent lights buzzing, papers stacked high, and somewhere someone thinking, maybe we can just fake an entire war. Sleepy yet? No? Don't worry, the craziest parts are still ahead. When we come back, we'll dive deeper into the memo itself, the step-by-step guide on how to fake an invasion. And yes, it's as wild as it sounds. You're listening to Sleepy Dreamer in America. History that's too weird to be fiction, told softly enough to dream on. So let's move closer to the memo itself, the part where imagination and paperwork meet in a very awkward, slightly sinister dance. The document is clinical about the kinds of spectacles it suggested, and because bureaucracy loves options, it offered several variations, like a macabre menu at a restaurant where every dish is called plausible deniability. There were proposals to stage bombings in U.S. cities, claims calling for the illusion of Cuban agents carrying out sabotage. There were ideas to develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, to place phony evidence implicating Cuban operatives, to create disturbing incidents that would push public opinion towards supporting military intervention. They discussed simulated airliner hijackings, manufactured casualties, even using friendly forces to carry out attacks that would then be blamed on the other side. One entry suggested orchestrating the downing of a civilian aircraft, not by accident, but by planning it to appear as a Cuban act of aggression. Another notion was to sink a boat of supposed refugees bound for Florida, and then attribute the tragedy to Cuban gunboats. They wanted a string of incidents that would create outrage, funerals, headlines, angry congressmen on television, editorial cartoons with cartoonish Cuban villains. The aim was to produce a wave of moral outrage so vast it would push the country towards supporting overt military action. The prose of the memo is shocking less because it uses florid language. It doesn't, and more because of the chilling normalcy of the phrasing. Everything is written with that same steady, officious tone you hear in dry government reports. Objective, impersonal, considerate of logistics. It's as if they were writing about supply chains or training schedules. Except here, the subject is false flag operations. The deliberate creation of events to manipulate public opinion and justify the use of military force. It's necessary. To say this plainly, many of the proposals would have directly endangered civilians. They contemplated acts that might kill Americans, or at least put Americans into situations of extreme peril, all in pursuit of a strategic objective. That is the core moral horror of the plan. We can laugh at the irony, at how absurd the idea of a government staging attacks on its own people seems on paper. But underneath that laugh lies a shivery question about who in a democracy is allowed to make decisions about life and death on behalf of a population that isn't asked for consent. It helps, oddly, to think in the slow, methodical way the memo itself does. Imagine officers around a table plotting options and contingencies. They tried to think through the optics. Who would believe it? How the evidence could be staged? How investigations could reach the right conclusion? They laid out scripts for fake radio broadcasts, phony communiques, even false casualty lists. They thought about how the press would report it and how the public would react. There is a strategic clarity to the plan. Not moral clarity, but tactical clarity. That clarity is what makes it terrifying. You can picture a page that lists incidents as if they were calendar events. A hijacking here, a staged firefight there, a small explosion downtown, a body washed ashore with papers that point to Cuban involvement. They even discussed using Cuban nationals or Cuban exiles in staged operations to give authenticity to the false narrative. It's a study in how deception can be engineered to look credible, how the trappings of reality, physical evidence, Eyewitness accounts, news reports, can be assembled like props on a stage. Now, it's worth noting that this wasn't just fantasy. The military was already experienced in deception techniques. They'd studied camouflage, feints, and misinformation during World War II. The practice of deceiving an enemy is long-standing in warfare. But this was different because the enemy being framed would have been, at least on paper, the United States' own citizens. That ethical inversion, deploying deception against your own population, is what set Northwoods apart even among Cold War excesses. The architects tried to sell their scheme as pragmatic. They argued that an effective operation would leave undeniable proof of Cuban guilt. For example, they proposed constructing phony documents in Cuban handwriting, planting suspect materials on staged attackers, and creating a trail of evidence that investigators would sniff out like well-trained bloodhounds. They wanted to manipulate the chain of custody to make sure that whatever evidence surfaced would be persuasive and persistent. Again, the planning is detailed and unfussy. If you're going to commit an act of deception, better to plan for the details, they decided. When the memo reached the civilian leadership, specifically the Secretary of Defense and the President's National Security Team, it landed like a cold splash of reality. The men who wrote it believed they were doing their patriotic duty. They had lived through a world of existential threats, where a tiny misstep might mean catastrophe. They thought big, sometimes impossibly big, but their calculus was premised on the assumption that the ends could justify means that included deception, even against their own people. President Kennedy, when presented with these ideas, did something that in retrospect feels reassuringly ordinary. He said no. He stood, in that sense, as a gatekeeper against a radicalization of means. He understood that the legitimacy of a democratic government rests on its claim to represent and protect citizens, even in war, not to trick them with manufactured tragedies. He saw that using deception of this magnitude against your own population would do lasting damage to the social compact. Rejecting the plan was an important moment. It was an assertion that there were lines that even national security imperatives could not cross. And yet, the mere existence of the proposal revealed how close the United States came, in that worried era, to endorsing measures that would have consumed the moral high ground and perhaps destroyed public trust. After the memo was turned down, the authors weren't publicly purged or criminally charged. Instead, the paper trail lay quietly, filed away in classified stacks and archives. The Joint Chiefs continued their work, as militaries do, and the Kennedy team continued to grapple with the broader crisis posed by Soviet-Cuban relations. But the shadow of that planning lingered, a reminder that in moments of high fear, institutions can drift toward dangerous ideas without obvious alarm bells. Decades later, the memo would resurface after a government review of Cold War records. When it did, people understandably reacted with shock, then curiosity, then a flood of commentary. Historians read it as a window into the Cold War psyche, the ways fear can rationalize extreme proposals, the bureaucratic logic that can sanitize morally dubious ideas, the readiness to prioritize perceived security over civil norms. Conspiracy theorists used it as evidence of the government's capacity for deception, a proof text to justify broader suspicions. And journalists wrote pieces that tried to explain how such a memo could have been proposed and why it had been rejected. There's an important cultural aftershock to the story. When a government is revealed to have contemplated tricks of this nature, it erodes a little of the trust citizens place in institutions. Even if the deeds were never carried out, the mere plot suggests possibilities. That things we assume are impossible might, in fact, have been considered. That realization feeds public anxiety and is ripe for exploitation by those who spin narratives of omnipotent statecraft. So what did Operation Northwoods teach us? It taught us that the machinery of statecraft can be used for very dark imaginings, that legitimate institutions are not immune to plans that would hurt the people they are meant to protect. It taught that oversight matters, that civilian, Restraint and moral boundaries are essential checkmates to military discretion, and it taught that transparency, however late, is a kind of medicine. The document's release allowed history to assess and admonish the choices of the past. But let's come back to a quieter, more personal place, your bed. You're listening in a soft voice about the implications of secret memos and aggressive contingency plans. Maybe you're thinking about what you'd do if you'd been in Kennedy's shoes. What would you sacrifice for security? And at what cost? Or maybe your mind is drifting towards something more mundane. The image of generals in suits with maps spread across tables, smoking pipes or stirring mugs of coffee, wondering if anyone would notice a fake radio broadcast. Perhaps you're picturing a long corridor of files in a government archive, each one a stored memory of an avoided catastrophe or an escaped disaster. The world is full of plans and counterplans. Many of them will never be known by the public, and many more will be benign. But the Northwoods memo is a rare artifact, an explicit blueprint for deception that involved citizens as potential victims. Its existence forces us to reckon with uncomfortable truths about governance. That security, when unchecked, can pursue measures that betray the very freedoms it seeks to preserve. And yet, even amid the grimness, there is a soft, almost absurd, human comedy to the situation. People in uniforms, human beings with anxieties and prejudices and tiredness, are still human. They can make terrible mistakes. They can suggest monstrous ideas and be rebuked by a leader who recognizes the line between defense and duplicity. History, when told gently, is not just a catalog of horrors. It is a study of choices made and unmade, of character, of small mercies like a timely no. If your eyes are fluttering now, that is exactly the ambience we aim for. Contemplation, laced with the drowsy cadence of narrative. If you're still awake, that's okay too. We'll keep walking softly through the rest of the story. We'll talk about the personalities involved, the aftermath of the memo's discovery, the public reaction when the details emerged, and the wider lessons historians draw from the episode. We'll also touch on how this peculiar slice of history has been used in the cultural imagination, sometimes fairly, sometimes recklessly, as a talisman for distrust. For now, breathe slowly. Let your thoughts drift like paper in a slow current. The Cold War was a time of sharp edges and long shadows. Operation Northwoods is one of those shadows. It reminds us that in the tension between security and liberty, the line is sometimes drawn by a single person's resolve. When we continue, we'll look at how the memo became public, what exactly the press said when the story broke, and why modern readers should care beyond the immediate shock value. We'll consider the ethical frameworks that can prevent such proposals from ever being attempted again. But before that, imagine a single page in a file cabinet, stamped top secret, sitting quietly until someone decades later opened it and the room filled with a different kind of light, the light of scrutiny. Close your eyes if you like. Imagine that light is warm and gentle. Let it wash over you. Imagine the file resting, finally examined, its secrets told and considered. Allow the knowledge that it was rejected to be a small comfort. Allow the sense that someone said no to be a quiet lullaby. You're doing well. Keep breathing, softly. Even the most unnerving stories have endings that remind us of our better judgment. We'll keep going, but if drowsiness finds you now, let it. The rest of the tale will be here when you wake, told in the same calm voice, with the same little wry smiles tucked into the prose. For now, rest. So the years drift by. The world moves on. The memo, Operation Northwoods, becomes just another classified file in a vast ocean of Cold War paperwork, locked away, sealed behind red stamps and metal cabinets. For 3 decades, nobody outside the Pentagon even knows it exists. Until one day, someone opens the cabinet. It's the 1990s. The Cold War is over, the Soviet Union has collapsed, and America is doing what bureaucracies do after the storm is past: spring cleaning. A mountain of declassification projects begins. the government decides to unseal a whole collection of Cold War records because nothing says we're confident in democracy like letting historians read your weirdest secret memos. Among the boxes, tucked quietly in a folder, is a document labeled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. The year, 1962. The author, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The contents, deeply unsettling. The memo leaks out slowly at first, just a few references in obscure archives. Then journalists start digging. The Baltimore Sun publishes a piece. A few years later, a writer named James Bamford includes it in his 2001 book, Body of Secrets, which is about the National Security Agency. And just like that, Operation Northwoods becomes famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it. People are stunned. How could something like this even be proposed? It sounds like fiction, like satire, like a rejected Stanley Kubrick script that even Dr. Strangelove thought was a bit too much. But there it was, typewritten, formatted, and signed by generals. Now let's not underestimate what that discovery felt like in the 1990s. This was an era when Americans were still digesting the revelations of Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, and the Iran-Contra scandal. Trust in government had taken a long vacation. Then along comes a document proving that at least once, U.S. military leaders seriously suggested deceiving their own citizens as a pretext for war. It was like discovering that your kindly grandfather had once applied for a job as a professional arsonist. It sent a chill through the public imagination, and yet historians weren't exactly shocked. They already knew that the Cold War was a time of intense paranoia and high-stakes planning. They knew that intelligence agencies and military strategists had drafted countless bizarre ideas that never saw the light of day. Northwoods was a product of its time, a symptom of fear, secrecy, and the relentless logic of anything goes if the Soviets might be doing it too. Still, seeing it on paper made it real in a way that rumors never could. For conspiracy theorists, of course, it was Christmas. Operation Northwoods became proof that the government could plan false flag attacks, and therefore, maybe had done. So in other cases, it became a touchstone, a footnote cited in 1,000 online forums, documentaries, and late-night debates. If they planned this, people would say, what else might they have planned? It's a fair question, but it's also worth noting something simple and strangely comforting. Operation Northwoods never happened. It wasn't approved, it wasn't funded, and not a single person died because of it. It lived and died as an idea. A terrible one, yes, but an unfulfilled one. That doesn't excuse it. But it does mean that when President Kennedy looked at the memo and said no, he quite literally prevented the United States from crossing a line that would have changed the moral fabric of the country forever. That single act of refusal deserves to be remembered, because honestly, saying no is underrated in history. We tend to glorify the yes moments, the bold actions, the speeches, the breakthroughs, but sometimes history turns on someone quietly saying, absolutely, not what's wrong with you, and sending a memo back across the desk. Kennedy, of course, had a complicated relationship with his military advisors. The Bay of Pigs disaster had already soured his trust in the intelligence community. After that fiasco, he famously told his brother, I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. So when the Joint Chiefs presented him with a plan to fake terrorism to justify a war, he didn't exactly need time to think it over. He just refused, calmly. And in doing so, he set a quiet but powerful precedent. The idea that even in the worst moments of fear, democracy has limits on what it's willing to do in the name of self-preservation. But there's another layer to this story, one that's more human, more psychological. Why did the generals think this was acceptable in the first place? Part of it is context. The early 1960s were a time of near-constant crisis. The U.S. had just been humiliated at the Bay of Pigs. The Berlin Wall was going up. The nuclear arms race was accelerating. and every intelligence report said that Cuba was becoming a Soviet outpost, an island fortress just 90 miles from Florida. The military saw that as an existential threat. To them, hesitation meant weakness, and weakness in the Cold War meant potential annihilation. So inside that pressure cooker, the generals tried to think creatively, and in doing so, they lost sight of the moral compass. They started thinking like playwrights, not soldiers. They tried to script reality itself. It's an old pattern in history. When fear dominates strategy, imagination often replaces judgment. Still, reading the Northwoods document today feels surreal. You can almost hear the meeting that produced the polite tone. The way one officer might have said, "Well, gentlemen, if we're going to fake attacks, we should make them look convincing." And another nodding thoughtfully, as if discussing table centerpieces at a wedding instead of acts of deception. That's the power and the danger of bureaucracy. Once something is written in memo form, it starts to look official, legitimate. Less like madness, more like policy. The typewriter, that humble machine, has a strange way of turning wild ideas into neat, respectable text. And so, for decades, Operation Northwoods sat there, crisp, bureaucratic, horrifyingly tidy, waiting for daylight. When it finally came into the public eye, it sparked not only outrage but also reflection. Many saw it as a cautionary tale about what unchecked power can do. Some in the military community, interestingly, defended the generals, arguing that planning doesn't mean approval. The military, they said, is supposed to generate options, even extreme ones, and let the civilian leadership decide what's acceptable. In a twisted way, Operation Northwoods was proof that the system worked. The military proposed something and civilian leadership vetoed it. It's an optimistic interpretation, and perhaps a fair one. Democracy survived that test, but it also reminds us that democracy requires constant vigilance, because the line between thinking the unthinkable and doing the unthinkable can be dangerously thin. So now, lying there half asleep, maybe you're wondering, how many other strange plans are still tucked away in archives, waiting to be declassified someday? How many memos sit in boxes marked top secret, their staples rusting quietly in the dark? Probably more than we'd like to imagine. But here's the secret of history. It's not really about the documents. It's about what people do with them. It's about choices. And every once in a while, it's about someone deciding that sanity is more important than strategy. So when you hear the words Operation Northwoods, don't just think of the plan. Think of the moment someone said no. Think of that silent refusal echoing down through the years. A reminder that sometimes restraint is the most radical act of all. And as for the generals, well, most of them went on to long, respectable careers. General Lemnitzer, the chairman, behind the plan, became the supreme Allied commander of NATO. A promotion sideways, yes, but still a post of enormous responsibility. History has a sense of humor that way. The Northwoods document faded from memory again, at least in official circles. But its ghost lingered, a whisper in the archives, a warning about what fear can do when it wears a suit and carries a clipboard. And now, as we lie here in the quiet thinking about the Cold War and how strange it all was, it's oddly comforting to remember that the worst ideas don't always win. Sometimes they just end up in a file folder that someone opens 30 years later, blinks and says, "Wait, they wanted to do what?" If you're still awake, we're almost there. We'll talk next about how the discovery of Operation Northwoods rippled through culture, how it became a touchpoint for modern conspiracy theories, internet folklore, and the uneasy relationship between governments and their people. And if you're drifting off, that's fine too. The generals can wait. They've been waiting in the archives for 60 years. They won't mind another minute. The truth, when it's finally told, doesn't shout. It murmurs. It waits for you to listen. So, Operation Northwoods has been declassified, published, read, dissected. The ink is dry, the generals are long gone, and yet the story refuses to stay quiet. Because here's the thing about shocking government secrets. They have a second. Building in culture, in rumor, in the strange ecosystem of human imagination that thrives on what if. The moment people heard about Operation Northwoods, it became a kind of magnet for suspicion. Every time something mysterious happened, a tragedy, a political crisis, a war that seemed a little too convenient, someone, somewhere, would point to that old 1962 memo and whisper, "See, they've done it before." It became, unintentionally, one of the most cited government documents in conspiracy culture. Not because it was carried out, but because it could have been. It was proof of concept, a tangible reminder that deception wasn't just the stuff of spy novels. It had been proposed seriously by men in uniform who wore medals and shook presidents' hands. And the public, already jaded by decades of half-truths and scandals, was ready to believe almost anything. It's like the country collectively discovered that the parents they trusted had once considered burning down the house to teach the neighbors a lesson. You can't unlearn that. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Operation Northwoods had found a new home, not in government archives but on the internet. It popped up in early message boards, chain emails, and late-night radio shows. It was cited in documentaries about government cover-ups, used in arguments about everything from Vietnam to 9/11, and quoted by people who wanted to remind the world that even democracies have dark corners. And to be fair, they weren't wrong. Northwoods didn't create conspiracy culture, but it certainly gave it a vintage piece of evidence, the equivalent of an official government stamp on the phrase, "It's possible." The fact that the plan was signed by top generals lent it a kind of eerie authority. Even skeptics had to admit, yes, it really happened, at least on paper. But there's an irony here, one that makes the story both tragic and darkly funny. Because while Northwoods became fuel for modern paranoia, the actual lesson of it was the opposite. It showed that the system, flawed as it is, stopped itself. The proposal didn't become policy. It didn't cross the line from thought to action. Democracy, by a slim margin, held. And yet, when the document hit the internet, that nuance got lost, because nuance doesn't trend. What people remembered was the headline, "U.S. military planned fake terror attacks on Americans." And that's a line designed to make anyone's heart rate jump, even at midnight. It's understandable. We're wired to be alert to betrayal. When authority falters, even once, the imagination runs wild. One government deception makes all government action suspect. One fake plan makes every real tragedy feel like it might also be fake. You can almost trace a cultural lineage, from Northwoods to Watergate, to Iran-Contra, to the tangle of modern conspiracies that live online. Each era inherits a new version of doubt, and while skepticism is healthy, suspicion, endless, unrelenting suspicion, is exhausting. It's like we traded fear of the Soviets for fear of our own reflection. Sometimes, I wonder what the authors of Northwoods would think if they knew their dusty memo would one day become a meme. Imagine General Lemnitzer scrolling through a forum post titled, "Wake Up Sheeple," and realizing that his long-forgotten brainstorm session had become the Rosetta Stone of distrust. It's darkly hilarious. Bureaucratic paranoia turned into folk legend. And yet there's something poetic about it too. The very plan designed to manipulate public opinion ends up teaching the public to question manipulation. History's sense of irony is undefeated. But let's take a softer view for a moment. Maybe this is the real bedtime lesson hiding inside the absurdity. Operation Northwoods isn't just about a wild plan that never happened. It's about the human instinct to control what we can't understand. The generals didn't wake up evil one morning. They woke up scared. They lived in a world where nuclear war felt inevitable, where the clock could strike midnight any day. Fear makes people creative in dangerous ways. It makes them imagine control where none exists. That's what the Cold War was, really. A long, anxious attempt to outdream the other side. And Northwoods was one of its strangest dreams. But when that fear passed, When the documents came out and the bombs stayed silent, we were left with a choice: to laugh, to learn, or to let paranoia eat us alive. And honestly, laughing is healthier. So here's where we can find a little humor in the absurd. The memo itself is unintentionally comedic. The language is so prim, so earnest, so weirdly specific that you can almost hear someone dictating it like a school teacher, explaining mischief. We could, for example, blow up a US ship and then blame it on Cuba. The ellipsis in that sentence deserves an Oscar. They even wrote about using friendly Cubans to stage attacks. Friendly Cubans. As if there, was a sign-up sheet somewhere. Yes, hello. We're looking for volunteers for a pretend invasion. You won't get paid, but history might laugh at you later. It's absurdist theater written in Times New Roman. But behind the humor, there's something sobering. Because if those words had been acted upon, if those fake bombings had turned into real ones, the story of American democracy might have ended differently. The credibility of the government, the press, the military, all of it would have crumbled under the weight of deceit. So it's lucky, in a strange way, that the plan failed by being rejected. History often turns on boring decisions. Not dramatic speeches, not explosions, but paperwork that doesn't get signed. A memo that ends up in the no pile instead of the yes one. A red stamp that says, denied. Those are the invisible pivots of the world. And so, Operation Northwoods became a paradox. Proof of both corruption and restraint, madness and sanity, ambition and rejection. It became evidence that the system can dream of horrors and still wake up in time. In the years since, scholars have written about it with varying tones. Some horrified, some bemused, some quietly philosophical. They note how it fits into the long history of pretext incidents, from the explosion of the USS Maine in 1898 to the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. Each time the pattern repeats: tragedy, blame, retaliation, justification. But Northwood stands apart because it was fake by design, a pretext with no tragedy yet attached. It's like a ghost story without a ghost, and maybe that's why it haunts us, because it reminds us how easily stories can be manufactured, how the machinery of persuasion can be pointed anywhere, even inward. The best defense against that kind of power isn't cynicism. It's awareness. Awareness that systems, however powerful, are built from human judgment. And human judgment, for all its flaws, can still choose to stop. So now, as the night gets quieter and your eyelids get heavier, imagine this: a file folder, yellowed with age, resting on a shelf somewhere in the National Archives. The air is still. The words on the pages haven't changed, but the world has. We can read them now without flinching too much. We can laugh a little. We can sigh. We can learn, because that's what history does when you let it. It stops being a threat and becomes a story. And maybe as you drift, that's what Operation Northwoods should be. Not a symbol of endless suspicion, but a bedtime reminder that people once stood on the edge of madness and quietly turned back. You're listening to Sleepy Dreamer in America, a channel where the strangest corners of history get told softly enough to dream on. In our next chapter, we'll wander through the legacy this story left behind, how it shaped public distrust, how it influenced later debates on government, secrecy, and what it means to live in a world where truth itself sometimes feels negotiable. For now, let your mind slow down. The Cold War is over, the lights in the Pentagon are off, and the generals are asleep somewhere in history. All that's left is a quiet room, a soft voice, and the comfort of knowing that at least once the world said no. When we talk about trust, in governments, in media, in truth itself, it's easy to think of it as an on-off switch. Either you believe or you don't. But the real world is grayer than that. It's more like a dimmer dial that flickers, up and down with every revelation, every rumor, every half-truth whispered through the wires of history. Operation Northwoods lives somewhere near that dial. Not bright enough to destroy trust entirely, but dark enough to leave a shadow. Because after Northwoods came to light, The questions didn't stop with Cuba. People began looking backward and forward, re-examining everything. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. Could that have been exaggerated? Watergate. Was that the first or the 10th time someone tried to manipulate the press? Iran-Contra. How deep did that go? And in the decades that followed, every crisis seemed to echo with that same anxious question. Would they tell us if it were true? Would they tell us if it weren't? You can almost hear the hum of those doubts like a national tinnitus. The funny thing about secrecy is that it never really protects what you think it does. It's supposed to safeguard information, but what it really hides is trust. Once the secret comes out, it's not the content that does the damage, it's the silence that came before it. People don't mind hard truths. They mind being left out of the conversation. Northwoods taught that lesson quietly, without needing to be carried out. It showed that the mere act of planning deception can erode confidence, even if the deception never happens. And that's a strange kind of paradox, a lie that tells the truth about itself. When the story finally spread, it sparked a new wave of public introspection about secrecy. Should governments keep secrets at all? If so, how many, and for how long? Who gets to decide what's too sensitive for the public eye? The answers are messy because the world itself is messy. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a sense that the curtain had been pulled back, just a little. The idea that power and transparency could coexist began to seem not just moral, but necessary. It even influenced the tone of journalism. Reporters started using phrases like declassified truth, the files they didn't want you to read, once secret memos. Those words sell stories, yes, but they also remind readers that history is a living archive, not a closed book. Somewhere, right now, there are files that our grandchildren will read with the same mix of disbelief and déjà vu. And maybe that's the strange beauty of democracy. It's always a work in progress, an argument with itself. It makes mistakes, hides them, then years later holds them up to the light and says, "See, we survived this too." The impact of Northwoods wasn't just political. It was philosophical. It made people question what it means to be informed. Are we truly free if our understanding of the world depends on what someone else decides we should know? Can a society that values liberty also tolerate secrecy as a matter of security? The answer seems to be, awkwardly, yes. We tolerate it, complain about it, joke about it, and occasionally protest it. And somehow the system lurches forward anyway. And then there's the media, that ever-present chorus of amplifiers and skeptics. After Northwoods, the press became both more daring and more cautious. Daring in that reporters dug deeper into government archives, asking harder questions. Cautious in that they understood how easy it is to slide from legitimate skepticism into paranoia. It's a delicate balance. You want to expose the truth without feeding the darkness that grows in its absence. That's why stories like this one matter. They're reminders that transparency isn't just a political virtue. It's emotional hygiene for a nation. It clears the air. It lets everyone exhale. But of course, not everyone wants the air cleared. There will always be people who find comfort in mystery. Conspiracies, after all, are seductive. They make the world feel organized. If something terrible happens, it must have a reason, a plan, a villain. Randomness is far scarier than control. So Operation Northwoods became a kind of mythic artifact, proof that someone somewhere was pulling the strings. And myths are cozy. They give you something to blame, something to fight, something to hold on to. The truth, though, is messier and quieter. Operation Northwoods wasn't the work of a secret cabal of evil masterminds. It was the work of anxious, fallible humans operating in a fog of fear. It was a symptom of a world convinced it might not survive the week. It wasn't a script for tyranny. It was a cry for control in an uncontrollable era. Still, the legacy it left is enormous. It changed how people read headlines. It influenced generations of activists, journalists, and teachers who used it as a warning in classrooms and editorials. It inspired filmmakers and novelists. It turned up in television shows, in documentaries, in internet arguments that lasted long enough to make moderators question the meaning of life. But most importantly, it became part of the national memory, the collection of odd, uncomfortable truths that remind America that power must always have a conscience. Now, as we drift toward the end of this story, let's take one last slow look at the scene that started it all. A group of military men in 1962 sitting in a bright room surrounded by maps. They're trying to think their way out of a geopolitical puzzle. Someone picks up a pen, someone else starts dictating, and an idea, absurd, dangerous, almost cartoonish, becomes a sentence. That sentence becomes a paragraph. The paragraph becomes a memo. The memo becomes a scandal. And decades later, it becomes this, a soft-spoken bedtime story about how close we came to deceiving ourselves. You could almost feel sorry for them, those men with their pens and their maps. They wanted so badly to protect the world that they nearly destroyed the moral ground beneath it. Fear does that. It shrinks the imagination until only control seems safe. But Kennedy's refusal gave us something rare, proof that sometimes the simplest act, saying no, is enough to preserve the integrity of an entire system. The world went on. Cuba stayed Cuban. The Cold War stumbled forward toward its eventual thaw. The missiles never flew. And the memo? It sat quietly in a folder, aging like a wine no one wanted to drink. So here we are, all these years later, reading it aloud in the dark, turning it into a story, a soft murmur for people who like their history a little surreal, a little tragic, a little funny. You, lying there, may be smiling at the absurdity of it all. The idea that the United States once considered invading itself, and feeling strangely calmer for knowing that it didn't happen. Because in a world that sometimes feels built on noise and half-truths, it's comforting to remember that restraint can be real, and that common sense occasionally wins the day. The last line of this story isn't written in the memo. It's written in the act of refusal. It's in the quiet dignity of a decision that could have gone the other way but didn't. It's in the notion that morality still has a seat at the table, even in the darkest rooms of power. So as the lights dim in our imaginary Pentagon and the typewriters fall silent, take one last deep breath. Let the anxiety of that era fade into the soft hum of your present. The Cold War is over. The archives are open. The ghosts of bad ideas have been cataloged and shelved. And in the stillness that remains, there's a simple truth worth sleeping on. Not every plan becomes reality. Sometimes the world dodges its own imagination. You've been listening to Sleepy Dreamer in America. History for those who like their nightmares factual and their endings kind. Good night, dreamer, and may all your declassified files be boring. And now, as the story of Operation Northwoods drifts off into the distance, let's take a quiet step back. Not into the past, but into that soft, hazy space between wakefulness and dreaming. This is the place where all history eventually ends. Up, after the headlines fade, after the files are declassified, after the arguments are done, the past becomes just another bedtime story. One that hums beneath your thoughts and reminds you that the world, for all its madness, somehow keeps spinning. Operation Northwoods isn't just a tale of paranoia or power. It's a reminder that even in the strangest corners of history, you can find the outline of something deeply human. Fear, pride, ambition, doubt, and the occasional spark of conscience. It's messy, it's absurd, it's complicated. In other words, it's us. And maybe that's what makes it worth whispering about. Because history doesn't just teach facts, it teaches empathy. It lets you look at those generals, those presidents, those planners of fake wars, and see not villains but anxious humans trying and failing to outsmart uncertainty. So tonight, as you let your mind drift towards sleep, maybe think of the world that way. A long, winding story written by people who are just as nervous and confused as you. Sometimes they make terrible plans. Sometimes they make brave choices. And most of the time, they just try to make it to the next page without setting the book on fire. That's the quiet gift of history. It doesn't ask you to believe or to fear, only to remember. This has been Sleepy Dreamer in America, where we tell the strange, beautiful, and often ridiculous stories that made this country what it is, one whisper at a time. Thank you for listening. May your dreams be calm, your doubts be small, and your tomorrow just a little bit wiser than today. Good night.